Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and I am joined today by Brett Heinz. Brett is a program assistant at the Center for Economic and Policy Research, short CEPR, which is a think tank in Washington, D.C., dedicated to, in their own words, promote democratic debate on the most important economic and social issues that affect people's lives. 2 years ago, Brett conducted a study on another think tank, the so-called Center for a New American Security. The report is entitled The Military-Industrial Think Tank Complex, published in the Revolving Door project. Now, I found Brett in another podcast where he already presented some of his research, and it was so fascinating on this connection between politics, industry, and the think tank economy. And Washington, D.C. is famous for its think tanks, right? There's all of the lobbying, and then there's think tanks, and I think your point is that think tanks have started to resemble lobbying institutions quite a bit, and so I wanted to talk to Brett about this. He will give us his talk first, explain what the paper is about, and then we'll discuss it. So Brett, thank you very much for joining me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. I guess I'll just dive right into it. As you said, in 2021, early last year, a colleague and I, Erica Young, we both wrote a paper for the Revolving Door project, and the purpose was to analyze conflicts of interest in research that was being put out by another DC-based think tank known as the Center for New American Security, or by its acronym CNAS, which I'm going to be using just for brevity. One quick note before I do start, I always like to make the note that this report was released in February of last year. And as a result, most of the stuff that I'm going to be discussing is a snapshot of CNAS from that period in time. It's a growing organization, so people may have come and gone in particular positions, but the conclusions of the paper overall are the same. So as an introduction, the Center for New American Security, it's a DC-based think tank that was founded in 2007 by two policy experts who had worked in the Pentagon during the Bill Clinton administration, Michelle Flournoy and 𝗏𝗏𝗂𝘁𝗏𝗂𝘏. The views of people working at CNAS vary. They like to say they don't take institutional positions, but overall their outlook is very interventionist. They believe that the United States should be highly involved in world affairs, both militarily and economically. And they describe themselves as, quote, a independent, bipartisan, nonprofit organization, which, quote again, is committed to the highest standards of organizational, intellectual, and personal integrity. Now, this description suggests that CNAS is well aware of the issues that are created when think tanks start to accept money from donors that have their own interests. In 2014, co-founder Michelle Flournoy actually gave a speech addressing some of these issues, in part along with other topics surrounding think tanks. I'm going to quote her here at length a bit. Quote, "Every funder has intent. They're giving you money for a reason. And what you have to ensure in running a think tank is that that bias does not creep into your analysis or constrain your analysis. There are some organizations that call themselves think tanks that actually accept money from corporations to do very specific work that tends to advocate for the programs those companies produce," unquote. And this, she says, is a problem because it makes it difficult to tell whether research coming from think tanks is actually the result of independent analysis and fact-finding, or if it is tainted by private interests through donor money. And what makes these remarks so significant, I think, is that the think tank that Flournoy co-founded, CNAS, has a record of doing exactly what she is condemning in this speech. So in our paper, we argue that some of the behavior at CNAS creates a positive feedback loop of militarism, which we mean is a cycle in which both think tanks and their donors can benefit by pushing for more aggressive U.S. foreign policies. So step one is that donors, including defense companies, contribute money to think tanks like CNAS, and this gives them the financing they need to do anything. Second is that CNAS, first they write reports which advocate the interests of those companies, of their donors, and then they also try to put their staffers into government. So both of these things are done with the intention of influencing government policy in the direction of their donor. This, if it all works correctly, leads us to step three, which is that these publications and these staffers succeed in influencing government policy in a way that benefits the donors. So the defense company would see higher profits. And these profits, in turn, could be used to fund even more think tanks like CNAS, thus starting step one and starting the cycle over again. So our paper is sort of trying to prove that this is the case by looking at different examples from CNAS's history. So to start, defense companies donate to CNAS. That's step one, and it is the easiest to prove. Since their founding in 2007, we found that at least 29 defense companies have contributed to CNAS, many of which over many different years. And this includes all of the big five, so the Raytheon, the Lockheeds, the most well-known. The largest individual donor to CNAS, the largest person giving the money, is Neil Blue, who is the billionaire CEO of General Atomics. These defense industry are really only these ties to the defense industry are really only the tip of the iceberg. I'm focusing on them mostly because they're most relevant to the topic at hand. But just to give a brief survey, CNAS funding has also come from the Department of Defense and the Department of State in the U.S. It's come from NATO. It's come from 12 different foreign governments, all of which are allied to the United States, and also from a variety of different private sector places outside of the defense industry. So in 2020 alone, 18 of the largest 100 corporations in the United States all donated to CNAS. So that's Amazon, Facebook, JP Morgan, ExxonMobil, Comcast, on and on and on. CNAS even has, one of the ways they maintain all these donors, in fact, is through what they call a CNAS Corporate Partnership Program, which offers different tiers of benefits to different corporations depending on how much they contribute to the organization. A lot of this being greater access or access to reports before they're even officially published while they're still in embargo. And all of this brought together, it really starts to raise the question of whether or not any research that CNAS produces can be entirely independent of all of these different interests pushing it in different directions. But this is only really the start, and that actually gets worse. CNAS also gives its donors a way to directly influence the type of research that it's doing. It is led by a board of directors, but it has a second board, the board of advisors, which, as the name suggests, sort of takes on an advisory role. And in their own words, the Board of Advisors, quote, actively contributes to the development of the center's research, unquote. So for our report, we looked at who exactly is on this board, who are the people that are contributing to the development of CNAS's research. And what we found is that more than 70% of the seats held on the board were people who represented major donors to CNAS. So at the time, 4 different defense companies all had their CEOs on the board of CNAS, including Neil Blue, CEO of General Atomics and the largest individual donor to the organization. The board also included the leaders of 2 different defense industry trade groups, whose entire purpose is to promote the business interests of the defense industry as a whole. Raytheon was the least subtle participant of all in all of this. They gave their board seat to their head of global government relations. And government relations is in Washington, D.C., it's essentially a word for lobbying. So the head of global lobbying at Raytheon is helping to develop the center's research. That's step one established. I know I just threw a whole lot out, but that's all step one right there. Defense companies fund CNAS, and they have a mechanism within the think tank that they could use to shape the direction of their research. Step 2 says that CNAS looks at all these, the contributions it's receiving and says, okay, we're going to put out reports that would benefit the people donating to us, and we are going to try to put staffers into government positions to influence government policy. And I'll tackle each of these one at a time. So we're going to start by looking at the reports. In our paper, we went through 5 different examples of reports from CNAS that produced conflicts of interest. But for the sake of brevity, I'm just going to do 2. I'm already saying way too much.
Go ahead. I mean, this is highly interesting. Go ahead.
Thank you. Well, so to start with is private military contractors in the war on terror, which played a major role in U.S. operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, but were kind of controversial. CNAS published a report in 2009, 2 scholars at CNAS, and it essentially suggested that contractors were now an inevitability in U.S. military activity. To quote them, the U.S. cannot now engage in hostilities or in reconstruction and stabilization operations without contractors. and that contractors are, quote, here to stay, unquote. Several months after this report comes out, arguing that these contractors are a necessity, it is reported that CNAS was accepting contributions directly from some of these very same companies, including companies like DynCorp and KBR, whose entire financial existence relied upon US contracts during the War on Terror. At no point in this report did they ever acknowledge the fact that they were accepting money directly from the companies whose products they were advertising, in essence. But when this conflict of interest was pointed out to John Nagel, who is one of the co-authors and eventually now a former president of CNAS, he gave the following quote, which sort of tried to minimize the controversy. He said, "The people we talk to, our corporate funders, are involved in that business. We talk to them about the fact that we're doing that project, and we talk to them about their perspectives on it, but they don't directly fund that work." And what he means to say is that, oh, well, it's not a quid pro quo. They're not giving us money directly to write this report. They're just giving us money, and then we're writing the report. But what he acknowledges there without really going into it is that we talk to them about their perspectives on it. He's acknowledging that CNAS researchers might be in direct contact with donors while writing reports about the things that those donors make money from. And that's one of the examples. I'll go through another one quickly here. The B-21 Raider stealth bomber is a new plane that is being developed by Northrop Grumman. The Air Force is currently planning to buy 100 of these jets, although there's a debate as to exactly how many to buy. Some are saying, go bigger, go 150 or so, and some are saying just 100's fine, and so on and so forth. In 2018, a CNAS researcher took a stance in this debate and published a paper through CNAS arguing that the B-21 is the next evolution in penetrating strike aircraft, that's a quote, and suggested that the Air Force would benefit from, quote, adding another 50 to 75 to the planned buy. Now, here's the problem. Northrop Grumman, who is selling the jet, is one of the largest financial contributors to CNAS. Between 2014 and 2019, the majority of the money that they gave to all think tanks went to just one, and it was CNAS. At no point in this report is it ever disclosed that they are advocating that the government buy more products from one of their main financial backers. If you do a little bit of the math behind the B-21 situation, you start to realize just how cost-effective this is as a form of influence. If the report successfully convinced the US government to buy just one single more B-21 jet, then they would make back all of their 6-year contributions to CNAS 278 times over. To put that in simpler terms, if this one report sold one more jet, it would give Northrop Grumman enough money to continue contributing to CNAS for the next 1,000 years. So it's clear here that from these examples that CNAS is publishing reports which benefit donors. I think that that's sort of beyond the point where it could be questioned seriously. But that's only half of step 2. The other half is that they're trying to put their people into government positions in order to influence government policy.
CNAS tries to bring its people into the government.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, people who are either employees or fellows or some way affiliated with CNAS, CNAS tries to put them into government positions. So we can tell that this is happening by both looking at what they're saying and what they're doing. First, what they're saying, I'm going to quote 𝗦𝗁𝗂𝗓𝗏 here again, the same speech as earlier, in fact. Quote, at CNAS, we actually made growing the next generation of national security leaders an explicit part of our mission. She continues, we want to be staffed primarily by futures, 30 or 40-something experts who are hungry, entrepreneurial, and making a name for themselves. And we put that emphasis on launching them into careers in public service. Now, based on that criteria, she has a lot to be proud of. In the first 2 months of the Biden administration alone, there were 16 people affiliated with CNAS who were given government positions. Who are some of these 16? Just to give some more notable examples, Avril Haines, formerly on their board of directors, is now the director of national intelligence. David Cohen, who at one point was an adjunct senior fellow, is now the second most powerful person at the Central Intelligence Agency. Colin Kahl, senior fellow at CNAS once upon a time, is now the Undersecretary of Defense. And Kurt Campbell, the other co-founder, along with Flournoy, is now Deputy Assistant to the President and one of the most influential people in setting U.S. policy in the Pacific. So these are all notable examples of ways that CNES is going out of its way to put their own people into some very key nodes of government that will allow them to shape decisions as they're being made in real time. And that all of that put together, that's step two. We now know that CNES is publishing reports that benefit their donors and that they're trying to put people into government. Step three is the hardest to prove conclusively, and it's also the most important. It says that if all of this works out, then the government will in fact change policy. The most powerful government on earth will in fact change its policy to benefit these donors. But that's hard to prove because all of these decisions are made behind closed doors. We can't really pinpoint that a change is made because one person was there or one report was written. It's all very nebulous and hard to prove conclusively. But I would like to sort of finish off with one final example that would give an idea of what all of this looks like together, step 1, 2, and 3. And this is slightly speculative, but you can see how it all comes together just ever so neatly. The example deals with Taiwan. In 2020, CNES wrote a report directly to the United States Congress, and among its suggestions, it said that the U.S. should, quote, strengthen diplomatic and security ties with Taiwan, unquote, and that they should, quote, find ways to effectively defend Taiwan, the Philippines, and Japan from growing Chinese military power, unquote. Now, as you might be able to guess from earlier examples, nowhere in this report did they mention that both the Taiwanese embassy and the Japanese embassy had written them a check for over $100,000 during this exact same time period. Mm-hmm. That alone is enough for concern right there, but that's not even where the story ends. One of the report's co-authors is Ely Ratner. Ely Ratner served as an aide to Joseph Biden while he was vice president. And once Biden became president and won the 2020 election, Ely Ratner was brought back into government by Biden. And he's now helping to determine U.S. policy towards China in a very real way. He's the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs, which is a long title, but it's one of the more influential positions. Mm-hmm. So while he's now in government, he's not at CNES anymore, where he wrote this report. He's still giving testimony to Congress and still advocating on the record that defending Taiwan is very important for U.S. policy. He's still pushing for this. All of that together, that's step 1 and step 2. Taiwan gave money to CNES. Step 2, CNES put out a report that benefited the Taiwanese government and put people into government in order to help decide Taiwanese policy. If my model is correct, if what I'm arguing for is right, step 3 is that U.S. policy, when successful, shifts in favor of the Taiwanese government's defense interests. And this is, in fact, exactly what we have seen under the Biden administration. Previous administrations, both Democratic and Republican, adhered to what was called a strategic ambiguity policy, which implied but never promised that the U.S. would get involved if China ever invaded Taiwan. Biden went further than this in September of this year, though, by explicitly stating that he would defend Taiwan in such an instance. Now, this right here is a good point to start sort of bridging into what all the takeaways are from the paper. And what I mean by that is that we don't actually know the exact reason behind why the Biden White House has made this shift on Taiwanese policy. We weren't in the room when this decision was being made, and we have no idea how much of a role Ely Ratner played. But everything we do know is consistent with the positive feedback loop model. And if we view all of this as an investment by the Taiwanese government, their donations to CNES, and on the other end comes out pro-Taiwanese policy, it has been an incredibly efficient investment and a very effective influence campaign. Now, we know based on Ely Ratner's old writings that he has always felt this way about Taiwan. He's always believed that the U.S. should, in fact, defend Taiwan and that this is in our interests. And he sincerely believes in everything that he's saying. But one of the points that we try to make in our paper is that powerful donors don't need to change minds so much as they do need to promote the minds that already agree with them. They simply find people whose actual beliefs already align with their profit incentives, and then they give those people the resources necessary to ensure that they are at the forefront of policy conversations. We tried to sum this up in a couple of ways in the conclusion, and I'll just read 2 brief quotes here at the end of my presentation. And one of the ways that we tried to sum up was, powerful sponsors can ensure that people already inclined to agree with them are given the largest public platforms, thus ensuring that large audiences are drawn to those whose sincerely held beliefs align with their interests. And while it is difficult to say that CNAS makes an argument solely because they were paid to do so by defense contractors, it is difficult to distinguish between this possibility and the also troubling alternative that defense contractors paid them because they are making these arguments. The conclusion overall is simple, and it's that think tanks like CNAS can serve as an intermediary, which allows powerful parties to push for private gain through public policy, without ever making it obvious that this is in fact what they are doing by financing these campaigns. And this gives the business community an outsized influence in foreign policy making, which is detrimental to both democracy and accountable government. And that's the whole spiel right there.
Thank you very much, Brett, for these initial explanations. I'll have a ton of questions that I want to ask you, but I think you gave a good overview of how you think that some of these think tanks, especially, this think tank, this specific one, which is like pro-militarism, right, shapes. Mm. So the largest question in the room is probably what you emphasized at the end. So is this think tank, let's put it in a metaphor, able to shift the gears of U.S. foreign policy, or is it just greasing the wheels? It's just helping for something to happen that would probably happen anyhow, just maybe in a lower level or maybe a little bit more slowly, because let's be honest, like the Taiwan issue is not only a foreign policy priority for the U.S. since like last year or the year before, it's just increasing now. And we know that the Taiwanese are pushing for receiving more weapons. They have been pushing for weapons for decades, and usually the United States has sold to them like tanks that they didn't need anymore, right? Like a $1 billion loan in order to get some equipment that's 10, 15 years old, and they have been complaining about that. And so funding military think tanks with a military connection, to me, if I was Taiwanese, makes perfect sense. But what you're saying is that the connection is so deep that it can also seriously impact foreign policy decisions, even those that might not yet be clear, right? So it clearly shift also policy.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's interesting because the best way to think about this, I suppose, is as an ecosystem. And think tanks play a very vital role connecting a bunch of different parties in this ecosystem together. So, civil servants and diplomats, they have their own interests. Congressional staffers and White House appointees, they have their own perspectives. Defense companies, they have their own interests, which they're trying to push. Think tanks essentially serve as a way to bring all of these different groups together and find places of common interests and of commonality between all these pressures in order to more effectively push U.S. policy in that direction. The big question that you're getting at here is, can they change policy, or is it just moving or serving to move in directions that policy is already moving in? That is a lot harder to prove, like I sort of said, because there aren't publicly available data sets on how all of these decisions are made and exactly how much different factors contribute to each. Personally, I think that it's a bit of both. I think that think tanks are at their most effective when they're working in coordinated campaigns, even uncoordinated campaigns. So when the whole foreign policy establishment is moving in one direction, a think tank which pushes in that direction will find a lot more success than when they're pushing against the establishment. At the same time, I do think that think tanks have the capability to actually change the direction of U.S. policy, although it's often quite nuanced and it's very difficult to tell, because whenever it isn't spelled out explicitly in documents or in statements from foreign policy officials, you sort of just see changes in perspectives among the people who are in decision-making roles in the White House or in the State Department and so on. So, someone could, CNAS advocates for a position that the United States should be more involved in defending Taiwan. Okay, there are other pressures making that case as well. What is it about the think tank that actually allows them to change things? And it's because, Eli Ratner's position previously had not been held by someone who had all of these connections to Taiwanese financing and who had this long history of support for the policy that was identified and funded by the Taiwanese. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is that it's very difficult to tell the difference between changing direction and moving direction, because they are in fact helping to set the direction, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does, and it kind of makes the point that foreign policy making in the United States is more of a social affair or sociological affair than we would generally assume, right? I mean, the kind of naive view of how foreign policy is shaped is that you have the president and a circle of like wise men and women in a situation room that then make decisions based upon decades and decades of experience, and then they set the direction. But you're saying like, no, we have like we have all of this mid-level machinery, which kind of gets channeled through think tanks, that kind of like feeds the foreign policy decision making. And what's very interesting about your study is that generally this is the kind of role we believe lobbying has, because we know lobbying in the United States is quite powerful, but there are lobbying laws, right? The US government itself tries to kind of like regulate this aspect of its policy making, this kind of give and take between politicians and industry. But think tanks are not under these lobbying rules, are they? They don't have to sign up for being lobbyists, but they can have very similar impact.
Yeah, you're correct about that. So people use the term lobbying to describe a pretty broad set of activities. Basically, when people say lobbying, it is commonly implied to mean any sort of paid promotion of a particular political cause, or a paid activity trying to get a particular political outcome. But the law defines it far, far more narrowly than that. In order to actually have to register as a lobbyist under the Lobbying Disclosure Act, you have to be engaged in frequent campaigns of direct lobbying. So directly going to policymakers and going around to Capitol Hill offices, for example, and setting up meetings to say, you should consider this perspective, and I, by the way, am being paid to inform you of this perspective. But a lot of actual advocacy and pressure campaigns in Washington, D.C. fall entirely out of that regulatory framework. CNAS actually even has a section on the frequently asked questions page of their website clarifying that they do not fall under these lobbying regulations. So they're certainly aware of it themselves. Most think tanks, including CNAS, are set up as what's called a 501c3 organization. And what that essentially means is that it's a nonprofit which is serving a public cause. In this case, for think tanks, it's public education. So the idea is that as a 501c3, you can release any kind of political analysis that is actually aligned with, what you believe to be true and whatever conclusions you would like to draw. But the line is drawn at direct electoral behavior. So you can never say you should vote for this candidate or you should vote for this party. After that, whatever kind of analysis you'd like. On the one hand, this provides think tanks with a really broad freedom of speech that is actually kind of necessary for what they're intended to do, which is bringing together people who genuinely are experts on a topic to provide impartial advice, whatever direction the evidence may lead them. On the other hand, it also makes them very good vehicles for indirect lobbying campaigns, where you try to change policies by changing public opinion or opinion of a more specific subset of decision makers. Additionally, and finally, 501c3s, they're not actually required to release any of their donors at all. CNAS is more transparent than they need to be in this respect, and that's why all this research has even been possible. A lot of 501c3s can simply just say nothing at all about who they're getting money from, which makes it very, very easy to take money from one hand and then advocate on behalf of that hand to the public.
Yeah.
So there's a weird balance there. It's very difficult to strike.
But in the end, what needs to be the conclusion that needs to be drawn is that when we, especially from abroad, when we look at the United States, I mean, think tanks are famous in the US, and think tanks is something, for example, that Japan doesn't really have. They have like institutes and so on, but they're very different from what think tanks in the US are, especially in Washington, D.C., where you have like tons and tons of them on all different levels. I mean, you're in a think tank, right? And they all have their mission statements and so on. But think tanks try to look impartial and independent, right? And one of the words that in US politics is so like highly praised is always bipartisanship, because bipartisanship has this nimbus of being like being above politics, or being you know, where Americans come together and agree on basic issues. But you're saying like, okay, a part of that is actually just facade.
Yeah, it's very interesting, because you brought up the example of comparing it to Japan. What's interesting is that in a lot of countries, I'm thinking of Europe, European nations, for example, to the extent they do have think tanks, they're sometimes aligned with parties or with trade unions or with specific business lobbies. And it's sort of more, they wear it on their sleeve that we are an affiliate of this group and we're just here to put out research. You know who we are. This is what we have to say. In DC, there's definitely a culture, like you said, where it's very valorized to be bipartisan and to be independent and all of these things, which often means implying a greater degree of independence and impartiality than virtually anyone actually has, if we're being very honest. If you study any think tank long enough, it's pretty clear that there's a perspective that you can glean from the types of arguments that they're publishing. CNAS, interestingly, kind of used this dynamic to try to avoid accountability on a lot of these conflicts of interest issues. Because in their report, I note that for a lot of publications, they'll go out of their way to say, we do not take institutional positions. We are so impartial that as an organization, we don't even collectively believe anything. We're just a group of experts who all have individual opinions and debate with one another. And I mean, there's a degree of truth to that in the sense that there are scholars at CNAS who disagree on particular issues, but it is very, very clear that they have a strong ideological outlook that could be gleaned by any number of reports that they've written. And I think that not acknowledging that, especially when there's donor interests behind it, is very corrosive to the sort of transparency that's necessary for people to actually evaluate what information is accurate or not.
Yeah, and I do think that we probably just have to extend Noam Chomsky's argument about manufacturing consent to the think tank world as well, right? That the people who are in these think tanks wouldn't be there had they different opinions or different analysis. So the selection process itself is already such that then gives the institution a very certain direction. That's why I think it's so important to learn about the think tanks that we read, whose reports we read beforehand, also because they collect these people, right? I mean, your think tank is directed towards, well, economic research and center-left political viewpoints. We have the Quincy Institute and another Quincy think tank where Anatol Lieven is at, and so on, where pro-peace or anti-militarist voices are gathered. So this is just, the question to me is this just a normal part of US foreign policy, how it has always worked, or is this something that changed over the last 20, 30 years that wasn't there before? Did this economy, this military-industrial think tank complex already exist in the 1980s and 1990s, or is it new?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a bit of both. So obviously the military-industrial complex really came into its own during and especially in the aftermath of World War II. But at that time, it was still very in an early phase, and it's sort of still coming into formation. So there wasn't a lot of complexity to it. There was just private companies, and then there was the Pentagon, and they did business with each other. And all these sort of outside organizations came later at sort of their own pace. There was always a tie between the military and think tanks in the United States through the Rand Corporation, which is definitely one of the most distinguished think tanks in the United States. but it's gets the it's very kind of an open secret that it is the US government's think tank, in the sense that most of their funding comes from US government sources, and they always can be relied on to provide sort of technical granular analysis on things that are of particular interest to different departments of the government. So you could see it early in the Rand Corporation years, but I think that it was given new birth during the 80s and the late 70s, when there was sort of a renaissance of conservative think tanks in Washington, D.C. So you start to see the Heritage Foundation play a much larger influence. The American Enterprise Institute they were formed in the 30s, but they really started to get influential in the 1970s, and a lot of other more neoconservative groups that emerged out of the Reagan right. I think that that sort of new wave of new right think tanks provided a lot of fertile ground for the military industrial complex to get involved, because it just so happened that all of these policy experts were advocating for things that would create much larger new demand for military contractors, even as the Cold War was winding down. So even as the Soviet Union was on its way to collapse and unipolarity was emerging, there still needed to be a way of maintaining demand for the services of these companies. And I think that sort of the explosion in neoliberal money that entered Washington, D.C. in the 1970s and 80s helped integrate think tanks into the military-industrial complex closer.
You know, I talked to a researcher about a month ago, 𝗟𝗘𝗂𝘁𝗂𝘁𝗐. She did a wonderful research on US interventions, a data set of 400 interventions. And one of the outcomes is that the US intervened more in world affairs after the Second World War than 150 years before, and more after the end of the Cold War than during the Cold War. And I wonder if there is a correlation between the number of interventions and let's say, the activities of think tanks and the military-industrial complex. If there was, it would lend a lot of credibility to the view that there's an outsized influence of industry on foreign policy, and not in a pacifist way.
Yeah, absolutely. For one thing, I'd be interested to see that data set. I need to hunt that down when we're done here.
I'll send you her address.
Very easy for me to believe that military. Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, it's very easy for me to believe that military interventions escalated after World War II as opposed to before. It's more surprising to hear that they escalated after the end of the Cold War than during. That, I think, is a topic that is in need of much more research, and it sounds like that this is already being done. But what's interesting to me is that there was sort of a crisis in foreign policymaking circles in Washington, D.C. after the fall of the Soviet Union, because that was sort of the crisis that had been driving U.S. foreign policy for the better part of half a century. And once that great opponent disappeared, there was kind of a loss of purpose. There was a question of, okay, we've created this incredibly powerful military machinery. What are we doing with it now? And there was a sense amongst, there was a debate in the Clinton years among these sorts of things. And Michelle Flournoy actually helped to play a role in all of this while she was at the Pentagon, and Kurt Campbell as well. But what's interesting to me is that it seems as though the United States has kind of adopted a strategy of finding smaller interventions that hypothetically would be much easier to win in order to claim victory. So you look at, in the 90s, the Gulf War in Kuwait, you look at the invasion of Grenada and these sorts of things where, until it went, this really happened, I guess, until Somalia, where the Black Hawk Down incident sort of like raised even more questions around how involved should we actually be in any of these sorts of things. But this has basically just provided so many new venues for defense contractors to get involved in, as opposed to all of them, you think of the World War II Fordist model where they're all just pumping out the same plane over and over again. Now it's, who can create surveillance technology that works in the jungles of Colombia? Who can create a drone that can operate at high altitudes above Yemen. It's all of these different business opportunities. And along with that, it creates all of these different entry points for these industry players to start exercising influence.
Yeah, and once you have that kind of technology, then you need to make sure that the need for it remains. So there's a strong incentive to push for intervention, right? So this would maybe explain a lot of the of U.S. interventions. Maybe a last question I have though is, peace is, at least in my view, also good for business. A lot of industries depend on access to other countries and on trade and so on. A lot of them, right? Not all industries are war industries. Why is it that it seems as if, though, in US foreign policy, the war industry has such an outsized influence on through think tanks and lobbying on US foreign policy, as opposed to the peace dependent industries?
No, I think that's a great question. And I think the biggest factor that sort of answers that is the fact that different sectors of industry in the United States have different priorities. So as a result, they wind up pushing for different objectives in foreign policy. And sometimes those objectives are even contradictory to one another. So you'll have banking pushing for something which agriculture is pushing against, or something of that variety. So I guess two responses to your question. First, as you've noted, the defense industry does play a very outsized role in these sorts of foreign policy making influence campaigns in Washington, D.C. And I think the reason that it's the defense industry doing that specifically is that they know how directly reliant they are on the United States government, more so than other companies. So Lockheed Martin gets 70% of its revenues from contracts with the United States government, and almost all defense companies, their main customer is the U.S. government. Mm-hmm. So if there were a change in U.S. policy that were to move away from foreign interventions and from large military spending, then it would directly affect their bottom line. And that creates a very strong profit incentive for them to keep endless wars endless and to keep the Pentagon bloated. At the same time, though, I will note that this conversation shouldn't be happening at the exclusion of focusing on the ways that other industries get involved in this sort of thing. And in my report and some other work, I touch on this a little bit, but one that's very interesting to me with just CNAS as an example is oil. So 4 companies that CNAS took money from: BP, Chevron, ExxonMobil, and Shell. And then around this same time, they began advocating, including in testimony in front of Congress, saying that the United States needs to get rid of our ban on the export of crude oil. We are losing out on strategic benefits that could come from U.S. exports of oil through these companies. And as it just so happens, all of these companies that were funding CNAS while they were making this argument, they were also actually registered as lobbyists on this particular issue. So they were directly involved in lobbying the government to change this policy at the same time that they were all funding CNAS, which coincidentally it aligned exactly with their lobbying campaign. So you can really sort of take a look at all the different interests that different industries have and see the ways that they differ from one another. To your point about peace being profitable, that's very true in the sense especially for trade intensive industries. Ones that rely heavily on imports and exports, they need calm conditions across the world in order for things to succeed. And as a result, a lot of the time they don't go for quite as militaristic of an approach as other industries do. However, what they do is advocate for expanded U.S. market access. Mm-hmm. And you can, going back to William Appleman Williams, there's been a lot of research that's been done over the years of just how much the U.S. business community has been involved in pushing for expanding access to foreign markets for U.S. companies. And then that sort of open door policy has underwritten a lot of our trade policies and our defense policies as well. So those aren't necessarily in conflict with one another. If everyone could get their cake, it would look like the United States being highly aggressive overseas while also going to great lengths to try to stabilize the world environment. And that is contradictory. And I do think that we see a bit of both of that.
Highly interesting. Thank you very much, Brett. We've talked now for 45 minutes, so I do have to wrap it up here. But I learned through you today that in the US you have a front door to foreign policy, which is lobbying, and you have a back door, which is the think tank world. And it's apparently highly complex, and I do hope that we will get more research out on the way this influence system works. I will put, of course, your paper into the description of the video, and I hope to talk to you again very soon.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.